All right, so welcome to another Bookoccino evening. I think you realize it's not going to quite be like any others. I said, Ben, who do you want to interview you? Because that's the way, as you all know, that we normally do it. He said, I don't need an interviewer. I'll just talk. His children and many of his friends have assured me we don't have to worry about that. He can easily talk.
I just need to interrupt you there. Richard Flanagan asked me to ask you a question at that point. And I quote, "Why the hell aren't you in the Ukraine? Who's Quilty? ? You're only 80, go back to the war."
This is going to be a different night.
This is going to go well.
And I've been at a loss, how am I going to introduce Ben? I mean, how does an ink-stained hack like me introduce one of Australia's greatest artists? I mean, he's got the Archibald Prize, and he's been exhibited from around the world, from Korea and the Philippines to London and Paris. I realized, I could list all of his awards, achievement, and exhibitions. First of all, it would take up most of the evening. Second of all, it would lose the moral character of Ben Quilty. Ben Quilty was born into an upper-middle-class Sydney family in 1973. He attended a Catholic boys' school where, a dutiful child, at the end of his first term in grade 7, he topped his religious studies class. His teacher, a brother of the order that ran the school, summoned the young student to an office where the brother congratulated him and then gave him the strap. From that day, Quilty kept a diary recording each time he was strapped. Though through the rest of grade 7, the same brother strapped him 50 times. With each strike of the strap, an inexplicable void opened up further and larger in front of the child, and that's when Ben Quilty became an artist. And Richard Flanagan writes, not decided to become an artist, not chose to become an artist, became an artist.
It's strangely fitting that we're here. In about late 90s, I came to a wedding here of one of my oldest friends from primary school. And the wedding was quite wild. We were pretty in the height of that flawed masculinity, which I went on to make work about. I'm still making work about it. I didn't understand it. I didn't actually really like it. I was a willing participant in it, but where I grew up, there was not much else of a choice, to be honest. The weekend before the wedding that was here, and it was Woody and Jodie's wedding, we took a boat from the pub at Newport on the Pittwater side, and we did a boat cruise, 9 of us on the boat up the Hawkesbury River. One of the boys was the ferry driver at Wiseman's Ferry, and after school he'd got that job. He used to sit on the ferry, and we'd sit on the ferry with him and smoke drugs and drink beer all through the night. On that particular boat cruise, we took the boat, and we were young men, 9 of us, and after the first night at that pub, in the morning, Kieran didn't get back on the boat. He'd gone. And I had a huge lens, and I was always photographing this. Those boys always teased me about it. I photographed all the spots around the boat where he might be, under upturned dinghies on the shore, possibly in houses with some young girl that he'd met that night. And we then took off and went for 48 hours or 72 hours up the Hawkesbury. He'd fallen off the boat that night and drowned in the river. So that's sort of confronting. The last time I was here was that wedding 1 week later, and we forged on and had the wedding. Kieran was the best man. A lot of people in my community at that point really, really did not understand what was happening to that group of people, or in fact to all of the young men from the areas that I was growing up in. The violence, the drugs, the alcohol, the destructive, self-destructive behaviour. My parents, mum and dad, most definitely did not understand it. But I did. I understood what had happened to Kieran. I understood why. It's just taken many years and many paintings to try and tell that story. And it wasn't our fault. It really wasn't. There was all sorts of societal constructs that meant that it was impossible to be normal in terms of normal after really the reason I studied feminist theory was to try and understand what was going on with my men. And it was incredibly insightful to study at University of Western Sydney. Now, I should say I went to art school after that brother flogged me, and I still don't understand why he flogged me. A few years ago actually, he died, and my school contacted me, would I donate paintings or money to build a memorial to Brother Luke. I wrote back to them and I thought now's the time, and I actually ran it past Dad, and some of you would know my dad, who's a brilliant man, and the greatest thing about Dad is that he's shifted and changed, and it's not only admirable, it's an inspiration to see someone grow, particularly men. You women are much better at it. So I wrote a letter and Dad said, sleep on it. You might want to take the anger out of it. So I did. I made it pretty calm. I wrote to him. I was 12. I was the school captain of my massive public primary school, and I won the Citizenship Award, which my parents were the most proud of, far more than anything else I'd achieved at 11 years old. And then this brother picked me to flog the shit out of me. And the head teacher wrote back, and no apology, which now I realise what that means, to apologise to someone. I wasn't abused anywhere near people that I've met along the way were. And he said, you've done so well in your life. The next step in your journey is to learn forgiveness. So I wrote another email back. I actually tore it up. I draw better than I can write, and I drew that. And I sent it to them, and I haven't heard back. I'm still waiting. So it is very poignant that we're here. And I'd just like to fill in a few bits. And please, we should talk, Ray, because I do have questions about you and why aren't you at the Ukraine? Flan plays a big part in my life. We've become very, very close mates, Richard and I. He's like me, a bit mental, through the destructive streak of his youth, to find creativity in a community that on the whole celebrates it, but on a very human level, you don't want your son or daughter saying they want to go to art school when they're 17 or 18. If you're honest with yourselves, it's pretty scary. My son's now saying it to me, and I find myself going, what the fuck, are you serious? I met Flan in Bali. I was going there to see Myra and Sukumaran over and over again. And the Ubud Writers Festival asked if I would go there to speak. And I'm like, I'm not really an author. I haven't written well. I've drawn a few drawings, and but I said, yes, I'll go there. They asked me to go there. In a sense, the greatest way to use a writers' festival, any creative process, to tell a story, to try and affect change in Indonesia. So I went there to talk, and I just finished Narrow Road to the Deep North. Now, if anyone hasn't read that book, I urge you to. It's one of the great pieces of literature in the past, modern literary Australian history. And it rocked me. It was so extraordinary and so poignant. And you know when you've read a book that changes the way you think, and you're left with it. You're left with pieces of that book. And I saw Richard Flanagan in this bar after a big talk with lots and lots of people. And I went over to him, and it's not the only time I've done this before. I actually got on one knee like an idiot, said, Richard, I've just read Narrow Road to the Deep North. And he said, sit up here. And I said, I'm Ben Quilty. He said, I know your work. And right at that moment, a reviewer who then worked for The Australian, very well-known literary reviewer, walked to the table and said, Richard, haven't seen you for ages. Do you mind if I join you? And I thought, well, I should back out. And he grabbed my hand and said, I haven't seen Benny for years. Do you mind if you don't? I hadn't met Richard before in my whole life. And we've been friends ever since. He fills so many of the gaps for me in that creative process about how we make work. But I should talk a little about this book. It's actually a catalogue of the work that I made through lockdown, from just before COVID, the pandemic hit, And one of the shows in there was Seen for One Day in Melbourne, which I celebrated. Someone saw it, I hope. Maybe no one saw it. But it seemed like the right thing to do. We then had a show in London, and it felt like the perfect time to try and make a book about this violence that exists in our communities. I'll wheel back now, and please ask questions. You too, Ray.
Yeah, go ahead.
We were going to talk. I didn't realise I'd bullied you into me just talking. But Myuran Sukumaran reached out to me, and I think life should be, for young people, and I have 2 children, there should be commas through your life where things change, you grow, you learn. As a young man, I had exclamation, exclamation, exclamation. I don't know if it was where I grew up or what that was about, possibly the school that I went to. And I'm very adamant that it needs to be discussed, that there are issues with the way we raise young men that really haven't changed. And I meet young men who go to the greatest GPS schools in Sydney and other men who are my friends from both those ends of the spectrum who go to some of the roughest public schools in Australia, and the problem exists in all of them. So when Myuran Sukumaran, his barrister Julian McMahon, reached out to me, and I got an email which I opened, thought, I know that name, is this spam? And he said, Myuran Sukumaran I'm his barrister, and Myuran has been making work, and he had a list of questions that Myuran had fed him about how you use medium. And for anyone who's tried painting, it's tricky, if not impossible, to make paintings from raw oil paint. It's pasty, it's sticky, it's like peanut butter. Sometimes you need a line to flow across a huge surface. And his questions meant that he had really tried. And I was so blown away, firstly. I mean, I should say I was asked to go to Afghanistan, and I knew 3 artists who'd said no to that. So, I mean, Mum says, and my wife Kylie says, I'm just nuts saying yes to these things. But the question was so filled with what it is to be human, that this person in that position was trying to do something so different against everything that the newspapers had told me. Not all newspapers, but particularly the Murdoch newspapers had you remember, coined them the enforcer and something else. The enforcer, and I can't even remember, I blocked it out. I was intrigued, and I said, yes, I'll answer your questions. And I answered them very carefully and truthfully, and told him how to do it. And I said, if you try this exercise, instead of making paintings of Brad Pitt, they sent me photos of what he was doing. He was making pretty bad paintings of Brad Pitt from pretty bad magazines that exist all around the world, just with different language written in them. I said, turn the mirror on yourself. In my opinion, good, bad or ugly are a much more interesting subject than Brad Pitt. And 2 weeks, I said, do it for 2 weeks. And I thought, I don't need this in my life. If you commit, if he tries, I'll consider it. And after about 10 days, Julian sent me a photo of the studio with literally 60 tiny self-portraits all over the wall. And you could see the progression, which for anyone that's tried, that's what it's about. People say they can't paint, you can't draw, I can't draw a stick figure in Australia. You don't hear that in France or Germany. It's like saying I can't ride a push bike or I can't kick a football. You don't admit that in this country. But it's cool to say you can't draw. Myuran picked up the baton and he ran with it. And I went to see him and we became very good friends. On the last day, and this is another exclamation point, I'm trying to lessen the exclamation points at the moment. On the last day of Myuran's life, and we'd all fought, we really fought hard. Not just me, a group of incredible people. The legal team was all from Melbourne, and they are my lifelong friends, extraordinary people, fighting for no other reason than pure justice fighting something that it was impossible really to achieve when we all look back on it. But on the last day, Myron was given 4 phone calls, and his brother rang me the day before and said, Myron wants to ring you. And the phone rang, and it was a huge number, so I answered it. And I said, Mayu, and he said, is that the second best artist in Australia? And we talked, and I said, are you okay? And he, obviously he wasn't really okay, but he was a beautiful man. So on that last phone call, the last thing Myron said to me is, I'm teaching the guys we're with to sing. What? After everything you've done? I taught classes to Myron in Quilty prison. He was the first person in the history of prison to have ex-inmates come in to continue their education under his tutelage, which is really challenging and changing the whole model of what a prison is. The Australian media kept saying that Quilty prison's the worst prison in Southeast Asia, but my brother's a doctor, and he'd done time. He'd worked as a young doctor in Long Bay Jail, and I think Long Bay Jail is far worse than what Quilty prison is. The better you behaved, the more creative you were, the more the guards and system would allow you to flourish. And on that last day, he followed Andrew's lead, and they taught all of those young men and one woman, who was finally at the last minute given a reprieve and walked free, taught them how to sing Amazing Grace, which blew my mind. And so at 3 o'clock in the morning, we climbed Mount Gibraltar near Bowral, a group of us who'd helped, and we looked towards, we found a compass and found where they were on Nusa and we did that at 3 o'clock in the morning. But the next morning, to hear the way he'd carried himself, what he'd done, and what he knew he'd achieved, which is really the core of what a creative practice is. You actually make something. You make something from nothing, from the worst part of yourself, from the best part of yourself, from your history, from the bits that people dislike and the bits that people like. He made something that was very meaningful, and if he'd had a bit more time, he would have really become an artist of note. So that's one exclamation point. The next you brought up was Afghanistan.
Let me just ask you about Sukumaran. It raises, I suppose it's the trite question, but interesting one. So he was a great artist. Are artists born, not made?
No, he's a terrible artist when I met him. Shocking.
What were you able to teach him? What did you teach him?
How to draw.
Particularly from that distance, or was all this when you went there?
Yes. No, it was just, he followed the first lesson I gave him, and if you're willing to...
What was the first lesson?
Turn the mirror on yourself, and for those of you on Facebook, my daughter and I put a lesson up about how to draw a face, that your eyes sit 50% of the way between the bottom of your chin and the top of your head, and that the bottom of your nose sits halfway between the middle of your eyes and the bottom of your chin, and your mouth sits halfway between that. It's simple maths. Olivia's 13 and she's doing maths with way too many letters of the alphabet in it. She's quite astonishing. She asked me for help and I just I cannot help you with that. So I asked him to follow that and look at himself in the mirror, and he exploded. When people say they can't draw, learning how to draw is far easier than learning how to ride a bike, and we can all ride bikes. It's a really simple, easy thing to do. You just have to commit yourself to doing it. And our community in Australia is so set up to criticise creative process. Just simple things like, I can't draw a stick figure. How many times I hear that? It's like saying to Adam Goods, who I know, I can't kick a football. You wouldn't admit that to Adam Goods. You tap him on the back and say, good on you, mate. So I taught him the most simple lessons about how to draw. We can all do it. And he then exploded. Look, the conceptual part of it, telling him that he's an interesting subject, I think all of us are more interesting than the people we think are interesting. Self-portraits is a really profound thing to do, to look at yourself in a mirror for long enough. I mean, look, you start to think humans are pretty weird, where the hair grows and where it doesn't. It's very profound. You need to grow a beard.
I'm one of those people who say I can't draw a straight line with a ruler.
Well, yeah, you say that. And look, America is the same. In France or Germany, people would never say that.
Is that right?
I mean, look, in France, so in Australia, when I won the Archibald Prize and the Brett Whiteley Travelling Arts Scholarship, I was taxed on those prizes. So $50,000 I won for the Archibald. The year after, it went up to 100, fuck them, excuse me. And I then became a board member of that gallery and said, you should have raised it the year before, but anyhow, you can't pay me now. But and back then we were struggling. Kylie and I were not well off, and I paid tax out of that $50,000, which put me into a whole new bracket. If you run the stall gift race in Australia, which is a 100-metre race and it's $100,000 pool money, it's tax-free. In France, it's total reverse. The arts are supported. There's no tax on art materials, and sports people pay tax like I do here. And that says something a lot about the society that we think is important. And the arts, we struggle. We really struggle. I mean, not really. I'm so fucking lucky. I live an amazing life being able to tell my stories the way I want to do it. But your question about why we treat these things like that, I think it comes from a very deep-seated... I think it comes from us trying to prove that we are real and that we are Australian, even though my blood is 100% Irish, 100%, and 100% convict Irish from 5 generations or 6 generations, both mum and dad's family, Irish convict Catholics. Calling myself Australian, if you have not thought that through, then you want to fight to be recognised as an Australian. And a passive, beautiful book or a fabulous painting doesn't tell you as quick as beating England in the rugby. It's as simple as that. And that's why we keep funneling, and this government is more than any, really. They keep lifting the money that they put into the Institute of Sport, and they keep shutting down art schools. Since I started art school, University of Newcastle Art School, gone. All TAFE art schools, gone. Sydney College of the Arts halved in size and just survived. College of Fine Arts, gone. ANU Music Academy, gone. Since I studied. And since I studied last year, the budget for the Institute of Sport is almost exactly double. If that doesn't tell you the story of the place that we live in, nothing will. That's why Flan's always so angry. I love baiting him about stuff like that.
Flan, of course, he keeps talking about is Richard Flanagan. Let me ask you about Afghanistan. I mean, here we are on the eve of another war. Apparently, we might even be in the morning of it now. It's probably already started. Will you go there as a war artist? I guess Australia is not going to send troops, and they say they're not, and the United States isn't. Would you go there and draw? And what would you try to draw if you went to Ukraine at this moment?
Look, it's another interesting thing that the National Gallery of Australia has faced bigger cuts than any institution in Australia over the last 4 years. And the War Memorial, when they finish this expansion, it's not a memorial anymore. Come on, let's be serious. And I value that place. It's not a memorial; it's a museum. When they finish that, it will be, by quite a way, the biggest war museum in the world. When you have a museum like that you need to defend the principles and the belief systems and the reason for its existence, talking about war is a tricky thing. The War Memorial hasn't sent a war artist for some time, and that's something we need to address. Because in Afghanistan, and we've talked about this, if you're an American journalist and you go into Afghanistan, as long as you've got a helmet and body armour, they'll embed you within 48 hours. So they'll put you with whoever you want to be with, and you go out and you photograph. You have to look after yourself, pretty much. The Australians sent, I think, they embedded 2 people. One was Chris Masters in 14 years. So in that sense, journalists are oversight, and war artists too, in a longer sense. They just refuse to embed them, which to me very clearly is because they're terrified of a negative story that would affect the Minister or the Prime
Were
Minister.
they dissatisfied with the paintings that you did as a war artist?
At the beginning, all I was talking about was post-traumatic stress disorder, and I became very paranoid. I remember one day a Chinook flying over my studio, and I rang one of my friends who was an officer from Sukumaran and said, "I'm just paranoid, but hear me out." And he said, "Benny, all the men with guns are on your side. We want you to tell this story." But the ADF, the broader ADF, and I think more importantly the ministry, were really adverse to me telling that story. It was intense. I was put under a huge amount of pressure, and I was just talking about their feelings. So they all signed contracts, which are confidentiality agreements about their service, which I think's pretty weird. Why? Why can you not talk about what's happening there? Unless it's risking young men and women, I understand. And I read their contract, and nowhere does it say you can't talk about your feelings. And that was my currency, how they felt when they came back.
And that's what you tried to portray in those photos, in those portraits?
Well, I had no idea what to do. I was pretty overwhelmed being there. The story was massive. The first night I was in Kandahar, rockets landed inside Kandahar airfield 4 times. One American woman was bombed. I mean, there's funny stories as well. And for those of you who haven't read Catch-22, I urge you to. It felt like being inside that book. All the Pizza Hut, McDonald's, all the big Baskin Robbins set up little demountables inside Kandahar airfield. There's 110,000 troops on the ground in that airfield. And they allowed all these fast food franchises to come in. But they needed people to service the pizza machines. And the man delivering the pizzas happened to be Taliban. So he'd go in and, yeah, this is pretty serious. These people have red leather lounges, which I saw right inside the bowels of Special Forces. And he was trying to give them directions about where to land a rocket. The only thing was the Taliban had no shoes. They had Chinese rockets from many years before, and some Russian rockets. And they were lighting the fuses with a cigarette butt and running off into the darkness, and the rocket would take off. So there was not a lot of strategic pinpointing of anybody then. But the scene of that was indelible. Like, it changed my life being in that place, and I couldn't wait to get out. We then went down to Tarankot, and I spent 2 weeks in Tarankot. And as soon as they knew I was with the War Memorial, they opened up. They'd been really trained to be very, very reticent and risk-averse to anyone from the media, which was crazy. I'd come from a media background. There was great stories to be told. I went to a little girls' school, and the first time in 4 generations, these gaggle of tiny little girls in cute uniforms with mostly no shoes were having an education for the first time in 4 generations in that town. And the men were all from Townsville, and they'd built, protected and supported that structure. So when Tarankot fell, which was missed by us 6 weeks before Kabul fell, it was crushing for those men. And it slowly, each base that fell swept through Australia like a black wave, because they'd lost people there. They were suffering the consequences of their service back here, and to see it dissolve and those little girls go back to hiding in their homes with the future of full-face veil and no education is crushing. But the thing that I found the most confronting was that and at the time I thought, why no journalists? This is crazy. It does not make sense. Journalists are oversight. Journalists ask questions. Journalists stop men who've done 12 tours of Afghanistan behaving the way men have behaved. And the only people who'll pay for it are those men, and it's actually really unfair. People need to pay for it. We need to learn from it. We should not send men there. And if we do, journalists next time have to go with them, every single deployment to every single place to cover it. That protected identity status was a fraud. Crazy thing to do. And every government, Gillard included, all of them. I was there when Gillard was in power. And it struck me that this protected identity status means she had half the Australian force who were not answerable to anyone, no governance over what they did, and no journalists looking into what happened when they'd been there. And we're watching now unfolding, only one, it happened throughout all 2nd Commando Unit and SASR. And I heard it then, and I actually reported it, which they wouldn't have liked. I told several people that I was worried, and this is what I'd heard.
Artists, writers are not great organizers. They basically are solitary people who don't particularly like organizations and don't like working in groups. How do you see that? How do you see that ever changing? How do you see the government, any government, labor, liberal, independent, whatever, ever changing that? Who's going to be the lobbyist for increasing spending on the arts like there is spending on sport in Australia?
Well, look, on a small level in New South Wales, Minister Don Harwin was the first. I joined the board of the Art Gallery of New South Wales 9.5 years ago, and the first minister, I was asked to go in and meet the minister, and he was a very sweet man. And he said to me when I met him, "I don't know anything about art, do you follow the football?" Fuck, really? And I mean it, he was a sweet man. But
I think somebody's got another beer for you.
No. Thank you. You're very kind. And every one of them that I met was like that until Don Harwin came in. And he had the ear of the Premier. They were good friends. They supported each other. She believed in culture, benefiting community, and it's been a golden age, in my opinion, for New South Wales. In regional New South Wales, it's been a game changer. I mean, we've built a regional gallery in Bowral for the first time in that place, and people flood through it. It's extraordinary. They've given away money and supported projects by ambitious people in the arts relentlessly. But he's a gay man, and he told me, I'm the first outwardly homosexual man in the State Liberal Party. And I said, what, in the 70s? He said, 6 years ago, which shocked me, I have to say. I thought, are you kidding? How are you going? And Dad, so I should tell you a quick story. Mum, and I've noticed a few of Mum and Dad's friends, Mum dated Paul Keating back when she was at school. And Dad, when she met Dad, he was the president.
Well, you're really telling stories out of school now,
they're not here. President of the Young Liberal Party. So Mum's like shifted and changed entirely. We should have grown up in the fucking lodge, but because of Dad, we grew up in Kenthurst.
Masculinity.
Yeah. And Dad, I said to Dad, I think Don will be in trouble because the incoming Premier is not, I can't see that working. And sure enough, he was sacked straight away. And the Telegraph, I wrote to the Telegraph and none of it was published, and I did it for nothing, and I wrote it without anger, sent it the next morning. They judged all the ministers in the government, and they gave Don Harwin, the Minister for the Arts, an F for fail, and he's widely loved and celebrated in the arts community. He has funded, supported, he's at every single opening. For the first time in my adult life, I've seen a minister who actually loves the arts, and that newspaper gave him an F for fail. So I just wrote in straight away and said, that's crazy. He's been the one minister for the arts that we love. And I haven't voted Liberal before, and I told Dad I did because of Gladys. And he said, no, he'll survive. That Premier won't do that. He's gone already. So how does it change? By us voting, by us speaking up, by us saying we need the arts. And the injustice of the IAS, I don't like to make it a point between, it shouldn't be us versus anyone. It should be that the arts is supported. Federally, I promised my wife I wouldn't be political tonight. I would say there should be a separation between the state and the church, and at the moment, in my opinion, there's not. And it's important. It's really, really important. I will never disparage someone's belief system, but the arts doesn't fit into that system. and it's been overlooked. There's no doubt about it. And you only need to look at the National Gallery with a several billion-dollar collection. Extraordinary, mind-blowing purchases from directors that we should all be celebrating. More than anyone else in this country, that museum has bought. They spent $325,000 on a Francis Bacon that's now, it's priceless, absolutely priceless. Not to mention Blue Pole. It's quite extraordinary as a test, as a social experiment in this country for support and funding to the arts. And that all goes on the bottom line of the budget every year, and it's several $billion. And you need to support and nurture it, and you need to be. The stories need to be told, I think.
Okay, if you have questions, start moving over to the mic, and we'll have one while you're doing that. Don't be shy. We'll ask him one more. I'll ask him the question about the book. Again, the basis for it was American boxing.
I forgot.
How did American boxing lead you to do these paintings?
I was given a book by George Bellows, a coffee table book of the beautiful paintings of George Bellows, American artist. In a sense, the Streeton of New York at that time. And I was blown away by it. It's beautiful. They're extraordinary. Did you know him?
No.
Ray. I didn't either. And I thought, well, I don't know this artist. Maybe I'll get one cheap. They're mind-blowing. And a drawing came up at an auction in New York, and I watched it, thinking I'd bid 10,000 Australian for it. Went for $3.5 million US dollars. But what's going on here? How can I not know this? And it is entirely because in 1908, when he worked, we were looking at England. We were absolutely not looking at America. We were looking entirely at England. I know all the painters from that period in England and nothing from America because we just were shuttered to it. We were trying to define ourselves through that British lens. And by extension to that, another reason why I think the arts is often not given the support in this country or disparaged in this country is that we have a lot to hide, or we have actively hidden a lot. I went to primary school and a state primary school and a Catholic boys' school and finished in 91 or 90, and our history in this country started with Cook landing and not having enough water and moving around to the next cove. And that's it. There was nothing else. And we're now starting to realise that the best thing we have is the history that goes back to the beginning of creation for the Indigenous people. And as you said, the artists that are making work there, it's not me being woke. It's hilarious when people call me woke. I remember when Tony Abbott said he was going to shirt front someone, and I thought, it's just disgusting. How do I teach my children not to shirt front someone in the community? But it did make me want to shirt front him, I have to say. That there are stories here that the quicker we tell them, we add these layers of social fibre to the place that we live in, which makes us so much more powerful. It actually is a good thing. And gone are the days, I hope, where the government hires historical advisors. Keith Windshuttle, you may or may not know, and it's good if you don't, who rewrote history. He said there was never a massacre, there was never destruction, and he was a prime minister's, for the first time in the history of this country, employed to be a historical advisor, to try and look, whatever lens you look through, it's propaganda, and it put off the hard work we need to do to become the great country that we deserve to be, in my opinion. And the arts is the quickest vehicle for it.
Question.
I'm dreaming of the day when men kind of come out and say, I've raped, or I've nearly raped, or I've wanted to rape, or I've watched rape. You know, and where men can say, gosh, all that suffering that those people had was actually because of what I did. And it's not with revenge.
No, it's a good
and it's
question.
not forgiveness, but it's an area, and I'm sort of like throwing down the gauntlet there. Yeah.
So, and I've been thought through this and witnessed so
Yeah.
much in my life. And Mum and Dad, we were pretty reckless, but Mum and Dad taught us, I think probably particularly Mum, taught us how to feel and really feel injustice. It's not genetic. Mum and Dad gave that to us from when we were tiny. I remember a little girl in year 6 when I was in year 4. They'd pull her hair. Her name was Magda Calusi. She was Italian. And they'd call her Maggot, and pull her hair and throw her lunch around. And I remember being heartbroken in year 4. So Mum and Dad gave us that, and all three of us are the same. But my first sleepover was to a boy's house, and I was 10. And Mum and Dad entrusted those people for me to sleep over. And in the middle of the night, the father came into the bedroom, and my friend was on the bottom bunk, and he was so drunk, and I'd never seen someone like that, and grabbed his pyjamas and shook him on the bed and then walked out. And your question, it's multi-generational, and there's no fix, and there's actually no immediate answer. It's going to take time, but I would say the recent movement to out men and cancel culture is just insane. It's about sophisticated, long-term love, compassion, forgiveness, discussion. It's not going to happen today because a group of people say this is wrong, because I can tell you, my friend that little boy did not break the cycle. And I didn't have to break the cycle, except for Brother Luke. But if I'd been in that little boy's bed then and had that father for that whole period, who knows what I would do? And I understand what that did to him, and I feel terrible for him. I was given the opportunity not to have that. I was given the opportunity to stand up for things. I was given the opportunity to have an adjusted existence without that in my life. But for the boys who do it, the quickest thing to get through it is to try and understand why that's happened.
Yeah.
And look, this is an off topic, but one thing I think that's right in the core of the way we live our lives is that pedophiles, men, are locked in prison with pretty much no hope of rehabilitation. That's where we should be looking, to try and help those people, to try and understand why that's happening. I pretty much understand it. I have 2 old mates who both sexually abused kids, and they were pretty much, I'm sure, were sexually abused as little kids. And there's no point locking them up. It's a waste of everyone's time. It makes them angrier and sadder, and it's not a society that I'm proud to be a part of.
Just a question. I'm actually a mum of 2 boys who love sport but also love art. And I'm just wondering, just any ideas and advice as far as cultivating and raising really good young men.
Not a very big question.
Thank you.
You can't blame me. Well, look, you've just got to love your little boys. There's this thing where we don't love our boys. I have a boy now who's 16, and he still kisses me in front of his mates. Some people find this weird. I shouldn't say this in public, but we're naked together. I still shower with my daughter because she's small enough to fit in. He's too big and it's awkward. But why not? I remember actually a man whose daughter was around 6, and he told me, I don't think I should be naked in front of her anymore. Well, why, are you serious? On so many levels, that's crazy. And for me, it was natural. I actually taught, and some of Mum and Dad's friends are here, I taught Dad to get the nude on again. You know, what are you kidding? It's a dick. What are you joking? Why? Like, the way we're conditioned to fit in is a construct. It is not natural. And for boys, I think it's easy. Just love them, and especially a few men. And I also have helped a lot of my friends' boys become, like, I look out for them and I love them. They're my friends. And I kiss all my male friends. Sometimes it was awkward for them, but they're used to it now. My dad was very awkward for him, but now he knows I'm going to come at him with one. Why the fuck not? Why can I not give him a kiss on the cheek, but I can give Mum? That's crazy. And boys live with that, And it's a stigma when you're a little boy, that now there's some reason that your dad can't give you a kiss on the cheek anymore. What does that do to your sense of who you are and how you fit into the world?
Years ago, I tried to buy Clinton Street station from you, and
That's
that
a
all
painting,
fell.
by the way, not the station.
I think he knows.
Yeah, I do.
And that fell through. We'd spoken when you were at Channel 7, etc. Wow. But I've had these paintings for quite a long time. You may have signed them on the back. I don't know whether you ever signed them on the front.
Never.
Would you?
No, I never have.
Never would?
I'll sign them on the back again.
You won't sign them on the front for me?
No, I never do. I never have. I'll tell you a story about Channel 7.
Do you want to see them?
Yeah, I can. Yes, I'd love to. Oh, that's a study for Flinders Street. Oh, wow. Wow. So the third one of them I won the Brett Whiteley Scholarship with and took... Yeah, the third one of them. Yes. Yeah, thanks. Amazing. I'd love to have a look after. I was at Channel 7. I worked as an editor, and there's people here who worked at Channel 7. I don't want to out you, but and it was great. I loved it. Creative, amazing. Finally proving to my mum and dad that I would get a real job. And then I won the Brett Whiteley Travelling Arts Scholarship, and it came across the Chief of Staff desk, and the Chief of Staff came into my edit suite and said, "Is this you?" And I said, "Yes, I just won it." He said, "Congratulations, that's amazing." Then my boss called me into his office. I was going to use his name, but that would be cruel. And I thought he's going to congratulate me. And he said, "You've won this scholarship." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You're never welcome back here if you leave full-time employment. You won't come back as a freelancer." Well, that's pretty harsh, but you can go fuck yourself. I'm leaving for Paris. And my wife finally
journalism, we've heard that story many times.
My wife finally thinks she met the right person and I'm going to give something back to this relationship. And just before the 6 o'clock news, the newsroom all sits down to watch the broadcast, and Chief of Staff got a fax over the news desk, and he said, "Everyone, I need to make an announcement. Congratulations to our editor, Ben Quilty. Good luck with your future career, Kerry Stokes." So to that fucking boss, it was amazing. It was life-changing. And the media needs to... I think we need to realise the media... I mean, look, I should say I was an editor without a degree, and I made a lot of choices that I should not have been given the privilege to make about how we view war through a lens. You know what I mean?
I think you should have been making those choices.
Well, I should have.
I don't think somebody with a degree has any more right to be making them or any more knowledge or insights, let me tell you.
Wonder if you have any insights to a very dear former neighbour of mine, Margaret Olley. And I just wonder, she was such a legend and such a wonderful philanthropist for the art gallery. And I've seen your portrait of her, which I just love. But I just wonder if you've got any gossip or anything you can tell us about the wonderful Margaret.
Yeah, well, look, the painting took 45 minutes to make. How long have we got? It was really
a couple of more questions.
It was one of those things that just went bang, it happened. And by then, she was my friend. She was a supporter. She valued the arts. She valued artists, and not just me, Richard Tognetti, Nicholas Harding, Cressida Campbell, who has a big show at the National Gallery this year. I think of us like ducklings under her wings. But she was just a human, and sometimes you forget that with people, but you never forgot it with Margaret. She was very human. I remember one lunch I was invited to there and sit around her table with that piles of crap everywhere. At one end of the table was Maurice Yemmer, who was the Premier at the time, in this little weird house out the back of Paddington, Edmund Capon, and Nick Mitrovic, who's my old friend, and she brought us together. He was at Newcastle as the regional gallery director. He's now the director of the National Gallery. And at the end of the dinner, I said, "I'll start clearing the table." And she said, "Sit down, Edmund, clear the table," which was really, really awkward. So Edmund dutifully cleared the table. And I sat down, and then I said, "Margaret, can I do the dessert?" And she said, "All right." it's the citron tart in the fridge. And I said, no, I bought the citron tart, it's not in the fridge. She said, put that citron tart in the fridge and get out the old one. So I went to the fridge and I got out the old one, opened the lid, and it had a clear dusting of mould on the top of it. I went back to Margaret and said, Margaret, whispered, there's mould on the citron tart. And she said, oh, darling, microwave it for 20 seconds. So I did. And I served Edmund thinking I've just killed the director of the Archive of New South Wales. And at the same time, Nick started choking. And I thought, I haven't fed him any of the citron tart, what's going on? But he'd swallowed one of Margaret's hairs, and she had very, very long hair. She'd sit there talking to me, combing it, and I said, pull it out. And he started going, and I said, no, swallow it. And he actually swallowed a piece of Margaret Olley.
All right, that's going to be very hard to follow. A couple more questions, and really make it a question, please.
The average artist trying to get going, and is there a way of providing some better guaranteed minimum income for artists, do you think?
No, I don't. Look, maybe it's Dad talking now and his capitalist, whatever it was that he taught me. I think if you're average, you need to get a day job like I did in TV. I hope I'm not...
Oh, no.
I just thought and the truth is, if you love what and I was obsessed with my practice from when I was at high school. I duxed year 7 art, year 7 and 8 English, year 8 English and art, year 9 art, year 10 art, year 11 art, year 12 art. Then Mum and Dad said, what do you think you're going to do? And I said, I think I'm going to go to art school. Dad shit himself and went really red. And my brother Simon said, what did you think he was going to do? And Dad said, I thought he'd go into the law. And so I always thought I would... It just didn't matter to me. I love doing it. And it's like it's like saying, how do you get paid for a yoga practice or a football practice? And I still play football and cricket and not so much yoga. But I think that it's a hobby that I love and I was always going to do it. And for all the people that have gone on to do great things in the art world, they're all so passionate like I was, and it will happen for you anyway. And possibly if it doesn't, it's because you're not dedicated enough. I mean, it is a practice, and it's called a practice like a legal practice or a yoga practice. So...
Well, I'll just pass that on because when our son went to art school, I felt the same. But a friend of mine said there's always room for another artist in this world.
Oh, yes. There's not enough of us. 10 out of 10.
Many years ago, when we went for tennis day at your home at Kenthurst, walked in, on the right-hand side was an easel, which your mother was very proud of because there was a painting by you of a sunflower, and you won first prize at your school. I don't know whether you remember it. But that painting, because of your journey, ended up making us queue for 4 hours at the Saatchi Gallery in London to see your exhibition. Thank you, Ben. And I understand you were the first Australian artist to be invited to exhibit there. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true. And that was, that was a career highlight so far.
Fantastic.
Amazing. But I would say, Leonie, that you lot used to drink so much port and so many cigars and drive off into the night. Maybe that's why I followed your lead? Yeah.
Listen, I have to say about Ben's mother and father, they're regulars at the bookstore. I've got to know them well. Rick and Dyer, just great people.
Can I just say, Dad was against me doing that, and that was a hard time for us. But to the question before about how to raise good boys, Dad, I'm not even going to say it was a mistake. He did what was expected socially of him to be worried about me going to art school. And I told him then, Brett Whiteley's my favourite artist. I got into Sydney College of the Arts, and then Brett died 6 months later of a heroin overdose. And I remember Dad saying, I told you. But that's such a weird stereotype. And the thing about my dad is that he has evolved like no one else that I know. And that's, I guess, it's never too late. Dad's now my greatest fan and still doesn't understand what I'm doing. But
I was sort of fascinated by you mentioning the violence that you're observed, and I kind of wake up and wonder, what the hell we are at the moment. Do you think it's always been there, or is it new? And
Well, it's a good question. This book, which we haven't really talked about much, but the George Bellows that I talked about, the Streeton of England, of America, made these paintings about boxing in New York in 1906, 1907, 1908, at a time when the governors of New York decided that boxing had no place in a compassionate, sophisticated society. And there's plenty of literature about what they said. It's quite moving that they were trying to plan for a very compassionate, violence-free community. And now UFC is the biggest export out of America and the most viewed sport in the world. So I think we've become far more violent since George Bellows made those paintings, and he would turn over in his grave now to think that UFC is an acceptable form of entertainment or sport. And the starting point for the works in that show, for much of that show, was I just started researching UFC, and all our children know UFC and understand it and watch it. It's sport for them to watch. And it's very easy to find that 61% of the top tier UFC fighters are illiterate. And in the first lockdown in Australia, 9 top-level UFC fighters died from their injuries. And if that's a forward-thinking way to consider teaching our boys how to be good men, we're a bit lost again. But I don't know. Is it more violent than the Romans? Probably not, but not far off. That's a very bleak way to finish.
Has anybody got a more uplifting way from that? Thank you very much, Ben. It was really a fantastic
Bookoccino is Avalon's premier bookstore at 66 Old Barrenjoey Road, Avalon, Sydney. Find us online at bookoccino.com.au.